There's a code only SEALs know. Say it back to me or go home, old man.
The chief's voice cut clean across the bar. There's a code only SEALs know. Say it back to me. Go on. You can't, because you were never one of us. The room went quiet. He was 35, loud, 3 drinks deep, and certain no one within 50 feet of him had earned the right to meet his eyes. Then a voice answered from 2 stools down. Quiet, steady. An old man, 78, who hadn't said a word all night, recited the counterphrase, word for word. In the exact cadence the chief had been taught at Budasass. The chief stopped mid-sentence. He stared for 10 full seconds. Then he asked for the second half. The old man gave him that too. If a man's quiet dignity still means something to you, type honour in the comments before you see what happened next. The old man's name was Earl Driscoll, and for the last 51 years, almost nobody in San Diego had known it. He came into Donahghue's most nights around 7, took the last stool at the curve of the bar, where the brass rail had worn down to a soft gold, and ordered a ginger ale with a slice of lime. He never asked for anything stronger. He paid in exact change every time. Before he drank, he would set his coins out on the bar in a single straight line. Edges squared, biggest to smallest, the way a man lines up tools he intends to use. Nobody had ever asked him why. Most people never noticed at all. Earl had the kind of face the world slides past. Deep creases at the corners of pale grey eyes, white hair cut close and neat, jaw that had not been shaved by a tremoring hand, because the tremor only came when he was tired or cold. He wore the same brown canvas jacket year-round, worn soft at the elbows, the collar gone pale from sun and salt air. His shoulders had a particular set to them, square and low, the posture of a man who had spent decades learning to take up no more room than he had, too. When he walked, he favoured the left knee. Not enough to call it a limp, just enough that you'd notice if you watched, and almost nobody watched. His hands were the most remarkable thing about him, if you bothered to look. Broad, scarred white across the knuckles, capable of movements so small and so precise, they did not seem to belong to a body that old. For half a century those hands had repaired watches. He could hear a mainspring breathe. He could feel a gear that was a hair out of true through the steel of a screwdriver thinner than a pin. What almost no one knew was that those same hands had once carried 4 men out of black water on a single freezing night, and that only 2 of the 4 were still breathing when he broke the surface. Donahghue's sat 3 blocks from the harbour, close enough that on still nights you could smell the diesel and the kelp and the cold mineral breath off the water, close enough to hear the rigging of the moored boats ticking against their masts, like 100 small clocks running slightly out of time with one another. It was an old bar, the kind that had outlived 2 waves of money by stubbornly refusing to change a single thing. The same cracked red, vinyl on the stools, patched here and there with tape gone grey. The same yellowed Polaroids of dead regulars curling at the corners on the wall, behind the register. The same low hum from the beer cooler, that every newcomer noticed, and then stopped hearing inside of 10 minutes. Neon sign in the window had lost its second letter years ago, so from the street it read Donahghue's 1, and the regulars had taken to calling the place Donnie's out of affection for the wound. Floor was scarred wood that had been mopped 10,000 times, and would never again be clean, only honest. Over the bottles hung a faded blue flag with a gold trident, a gift from some forgotten patron. Beneath it a hand-lettered card that said, "We don't serve cowards, we're out," which had been a joke for so long that nobody remembered it had ever been one. The bartender that night was a young woman named Mara, 26, working her way through nursing school on tips and stubbornness, quick with a rag and quicker to read a room. She liked Earl. He tipped fair, and he never made her his audience, never needed her to laugh or nod or pretend. He just drank his ginger ale and minded the small straight line of his coins and let her be a person doing a job. She did not yet like the table of younger men who had come in, loud around 6:30, and gotten louder with every round since, and she had begun, without quite deciding to keep one ear turned toward them while she worked. She had learned in 2 years behind that bar that trouble always announced itself before it arrived. A half-second hush, a chair scraping wrong, a laugh that had teeth in it. She heard all three of those things from the loud table. Before 8 o'clock, she set a fresh glass under the tap and waited. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the loudest man at that table was carrying something far heavier than the beer in his hand, and that before the night was over, he would be down on his knees on Donahghue's filthy honest floor, and not one single person in that room would think less of him for it. The loud man was Chief Petty Officer Tyler Brant, and he had earned every inch of the gold he was entitled to wear, which was a large part of the problem, because the uniform wasn't on him tonight. Tonight he was just a man in a grey t-shirt, gone soft from washing and a 5-day beard, and the world could not see what he had done or what it had cost him, and that invisibility was eating him alive from the inside out. Brant had come home 11 days ago from a deployment that had taken something out of the platoon it would never get back. The thing it took had a name. Petty Officer Danny Marsh, 24 years old, who used to do an impression of the Command Master Chief so dead on that grown men had to leave the room to keep from disgracing themselves laughing, who had 2 weeks left on his enlistment and a girl back in Ohio named Steph, and a folder on his phone, full of photos of second-hand coffee roasters pricing out, because the whole plan, the thing he talked about at 2 in the morning on watch until the other guys threw boots at him, was to open a little roastery off the county road and name the dark roast after every man in the platoon. Marsh did not come home. Brant had carried the flag at the service. He had folded it into 13 tight triangles with hands that would not stop shaking and pressed it into the arms of a mother who could not stand up to receive it, so he had knelt to bring it to her. And she had grabbed his wrist and would not let go, and he had stayed kneeling on the funeral home carpet for as long as she needed and longer. And now he was here, 11 days later, surrounded by guys who hadn't been on that op, in a city that walked past him without a flicker, drinking to drown a thing that would not drown. And the drowning had curdled into something loud and mean. He needed someone to argue with. He needed the whole world to prove to him that it still meant something, that the standard was real. What Danny had bled out for in the dust was not just a story the living told themselves. So he had started talking about the one thing nobody alive could take away from him. You want to know the actual difference between a frogman and every other guy in this bar? Brant said, loud enough, now that the dartboard corner went still, and a couple by the window stopped pretending not to listen. He wasn't really talking to his own table anymore. He was talking to the room, to the city, to God. It's not the trident. Any clown can buy a trident off the internet for $12. It's not the haircut, and it's not the truck, and it's not the stories. Everybody in America has a cousin who can't really talk about what he did over there. He hooked the air quotes with 2 fingers and put a sneer behind them. That there are things we know that you will never know. Things that can't be faked. Things you can't Google at 2 in the morning to impress a girl. He drained half his beer in one pull. There's a thing we say. A call and an answer. You learn it where they make us, down in the cold and the dark, and you carry it the rest of your life. And if I give a stranger the front half, and he can't hand me back the back half. Clean, right cadence, no stumble. Then I know exactly what I'm looking at. I'm looking at a tourist. A man cosplaying my dead friends. His voice snagged on the last 3 words, and he covered it with another swallow. And only Mara, watching close, caught the snag for what it was. The chief turned slowly on his stool, and his gaze swept the length of the bar like a searchlight off a patrol boat, daring it, hunting it. And it passed over a young harbour sailor at the rail who had gone red with second-hand embarrassment and hero worship, in equal measure over the couple by the window and over Mara with her rag, and came at last to rest, almost by accident, on the old man at the far end with his coins in their perfect little row. Brant smiled. It was not a kind smile. What about you, Pop? You feel like taking a shot at it? Earl did not look up from his ginger ale. He simply turned the glass a quarter turn on its coaster, the same small, careful motion he used to turn a watch case to catch the light. And in the silence that followed that turning, the only living soul in the room who understood that the chief had just made a serious mistake was the old man himself. To understand Earl Driscoll, you would have had to follow him home that night. Up the hill on Beach Street to a narrow apartment over a laundromat that had been shuttered since the spring, where one whole room held nothing but a workbench, a green-shaded lamp, a wooden stool worn to a shine, and an apothecary cabinet of 48 tiny drawers, each labelled in a hand so steady, and even it looked machine-printed. Earl lived alone. His wife, Ruth, had been gone 6 years now. A stroke in the night, quiet, the way she did everything. He still set out 2 cups on the counter every morning out of 51 years of habit, filled one, and washed only the one at night, and he had decided long ago that he would rather wash a clean cup than stop setting it out. He had no children. He had a younger sister in Bakersfield. He telephoned every Sunday at 4. And a routine he kept the way other men keep faith, the only crack in that routine. The only night of the year, or rather the one night of every month, when he did anything at all out of pattern, was a night like this one. Because today was the 11th, and the 11th was the day, Pitt. On the 11th of every single month, for 51 years, through Ruth and after Ruth, through 3 apartments and 2 cities, and one quietly broken hip he'd never mentioned to anyone. Earl Driscoll ordered 2 ginger ales. One he drank slowly, the way you ration a thing you don't want to end. The other he set down on the bar to his left, front of whatever stool happened to be empty. And never touched, not once, and at the end of the night, he left it sitting there full, and paid for both, and walked home up the hill. Mara had watched him do it a dozen times, and never asked. She figured every person on earth is owed at least one private grief. No questions attached. She had no earthly idea whose name was on that second glass, or that the name belonged to a man who had been dead since before her own mother drew breath, or that the words this tidy, harmless old man was about to speak into the loud chief's silence had been carved into a slab of grey granite on base 90 miles up the coast, carved as a creed, learned by heart, and recited in the dark by young men who had no notion that the man who first said them was still alive, and was sitting at this exact moment 2 stools down from a chief who had just called him a tourist. The strange thing about being underestimated for 50 years is that first you stop minding it, and then one day you discover you have come to prefer it. Earl had built his entire quiet life on the bedrock of being passed over, and it had held. When men found out what he had done, and a few over the decades had found out, they always got strange about it. Too loud or too soft, too eager to stand him a drink, too quick to lower their voices and lean in and ask the questions that have no answers a man can stand to give in a bar. He had watched what the not forgetting did to other men of his vintage. 1. The ones who had let the worst night of their lives swell up and become the most interesting thing about them, told the story until the telling wore it down to nothing. Until they were left clutching a worn slick coin of a memory, and no actual life built up around it to give it weight. Earl had decided, somewhere in the grey middle of 1974, with Ruth asleep beside him, and the ceiling full of things he would not look at, that he would not become one of those men. He would fix watches. He would love his wife. He would line his coins up on a bar and drink his ginger ale and let the whole world go on, believing he was precisely what he appeared to be. A neat, harmless, unremarkable old man who had likely never done anything in his life more dangerous than cross a street against the light. The creed they had carved into that granite wall said something about carrying the ones who do not surface. Earl had never gone to see the wall. He didn't need to. He carried them every single day, the way a man carries his own spine, without noticing it at all, right up until something makes him turn the wrong way too fast. Then it is the only thing in the entire world he can feel. The chief's voice, drunk and cruel and grieving and so terribly young, just made him turn the wrong way. And Earl Driscoll, who had not said the words aloud to a living person in 51 years, opened his mouth. He did not say them yet. He said something else first, something so quiet and so ordinary that it should not have had any power at all. It stopped the chief cold. "You boys still doing it cold water?" Earl asked, mild as milk, still not turning his head, still watching the bubbles climb the inside of his glass. "Or do they let you wear the dry suits the whole way through now?" Brant blinked. It was an odd question. An old question. The kind of question that comes from inside the fence, from out beyond it where the tourists stand pressing their faces to the wire. A flicker crossed the chief's face. Uncertainty, the first crack of it he had shown all night. "Excuse me?" "The pool first, then the bay, then the open cold water," Earl went on, turning his glass another patient quarter turn. "That's the order they did it in my day. Build a man up to the cold by inches, so it doesn't reach in and stop his heart the first time he goes under. Some of the boys it stopped anyway. I just wondered if that part was still the same, or if they figured out something kinder." The table had gone dead quiet, the young harbour sailor at the rail. His name was Cole Whitman, 19, 3 months out of his own training, who had been drinking in Brant's every word all night because the chief was the closest thing to a living legend the kid had ever stood next to, set his beer down on the rail very slowly and did not pick it back up. Brant leaned forward, and the cruelty had drained out of his face and been replaced by something far more dangerous to him. Curiosity, and underneath the curiosity, first cold finger of fear. "Who are you?" he said, and his voice had lost the room and gone small and private, and Earl smiled, at last, small sad thing that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm nobody," he said, "but I'll play your game, son. Go on, give me your front half. What happened?" In the next 60 seconds would be talked about in that bar for the rest of its years, and recorded shaking on 3 different phones from 3 different angles. And one of those phones, by the door, belonged to a man who had ordered a coffee 4 minutes earlier, and had not yet touched it, and who now, very slowly, turned his head. Brant should have let it go. Somewhere down beneath the 11 days and the beer, a sober and decent part of him knew it, already pulling on his sleeve. But pride is a current too, the strongest one there is, and it had him now, and the room was full of witnesses, and Danny Marsh was 11 days in the ground in Ohio, with a folded flag on his mother's mantle and a coffee roaster he would never buy. So the chief did the thing the worst part of him needed to do. He squared his shoulders, post. He dropped his voice down out of the bar, and into the place they teach you to find it, the low flat register that carries underwater, along a man's jawbone. The cadence that lives in the body for decades after the meaning of the words, worn smooth. And he said it. Tide is at slack. Who's on the wire? He said it like a challenge. He said it like a slap across an old man's face. He expected nothing back. He expected the old man to fumble, to look away, to go pink and mumble, to confirm at last the one thing Brant needed the entire universe to confirm tonight. That the thing was real, that it could not be faked, what he and Danny and the others had bled and broken, for actually meant something no soft civilian could ever reach across the wire and touch. He needed the old man to fail. He needed the failure, the way a drowning man needs a hand. And Earl Driscoll, 78 years old, set his ginger ale down on the bar, squared its base neatly against the line of his coins, and answered in the same low register, the same dark underwater cadence, no hesitation, no searching, no stumble at all, the words coming up out of him, the way water finds its own level, in the dark. Second man on the line, knife in the left hand, no light, no sound, no name. The bar did not breathe. Brant's mouth fell open and stayed open, and from the booth beside the door, the man who had ordered the coffee set the untouched cup down on the table without a sound, and turned the rest of the way around, because he had heard that exact cadence, and those exact words precisely once before in the whole of his life. On his father's knee, 7 years old, in a kitchen in National City, listening to a story he had begged the old man to tell him again and again and again. The man in the booth was Daniel Reyes, and the gold he was entitled to wear, on the rare occasions he chose to, outranked everything Tyler Brant would earn if he served another 20 years. He was the senior enlisted leader at the command up the coast. A command master chief with 29 years in the teams behind him, chest of ribbons he kept in a drawer, and almost never pinned on, and a reputation among the young operators as a man who could end a promising career with one quiet, unhurried sentence, and would the instant a man earned it, and not 1 second before. He had come into Donahghue's that night, for the dumbest and most human of reasons. His evening flight had been scrubbed for weather, his hotel was 2 blocks over, and he had wanted exactly one bad cup of coffee in exactly one bar, where no one would know his face or his rank before. Early and unpleasant meeting in the morning. He had been half listening to the loud chief, with the tired, patient, almost tender contempt of a man who had once been that exact chief, and had, by the grace of time and good leaders, grown out of him. He had heard it all 100 times, the bragging, the wire about the dead, the need. He understood the need better than he understood almost anything. And then the old man at the curve of the bar had handed the cadence back to the kid, clean and cold and right, and Daniel Reyes's whole body had gone to ice, because those were not words a man learned at any school that still existed anywhere on the earth. They were older than the schools. They came from a place that had been shut down and bulldozed flat before Reyes was even born, a cold water, annexed on a stretch of California coast that no longer appeared on any map, place his father had gone into the water at, and most of his father's friends had not come out of. Reyes's father, Hector, had been 19 years old in that water on the night it all went wrong. Hector had told his son every year on the 11th until the day he died, he was alive, that Daniel was alive, that Daniel's children were alive, only because one man had gone back down into the killing cold a 4th time, and then a 5th time, when every other man with sense was hauling for the rocks, a man who had found Hector tangled and sinking, and dragged him up by the harness, and breathed his own air into him on the wet black stones, until the boy coughed seawater and lived. Hector had never learned the man's name. He had carried only 3 things out of that water for the rest of his life: cadence, the creed, And one single word the man had said, over and over and over, while he worked in the dark. Count. Daniel Reyes stood up out of the booth. Brant never saw Reyes rise. Brant saw only the old man, and the old man had just calmly burned the whole night to the ground. And the chief's grief-flooded brain grabbed for the one rope it had left, the second half. The verification. The part of the exchange that even most real operators got a fraction wrong, part where the rhythm broke in a place. Your mouth didn't expect it to. Part that had never once been printed on any internet forum on Earth, because it had never been written down anywhere a forum could ever reach. Front half, fine. Maybe the old man had heard that somewhere, maybe he had a nephew. Maybe he'd stood at that granite wall up the coast and read it off the stone where the tourists take their photographs. But the back half, nobody had the back half. Brant leaned in until he was close enough to smell the lime, and his voice cracked clean across the middle on the very first word, because the whole night was cracking with it. And he said, then, "How do you come back?" And Earl Driscoll looked at him. Really looked at him, for the first time all night, clear past the beard and the bluster. And the beer down into the wet-sucking wreckage of a young man who had buried his best friend 11 days ago, and did not have a single human being in his life he could say so to. And Earl's voice, when it came, was so gentle that it was very nearly impossible to bear. By the count of 4, he said, "To the anchor, up slow and breathe slower." He stopped. The whole bar leaned a half-inch toward him, and then he gave the chief the line that was on no wall and in no book and on no forum, the line he had spoken once into a dead man's ear 51 years ago, and had never said again to anyone living. And you carry whoever doesn't surface every time, all the way up. You do not ever leave a man in the dark. Cole Whitman, kid at the rail, made a small broken sound like he'd been hit in the chest. Brant's beer slid an inch through the sweat on the bar, and the old man's eyes were wet now, and his scarred hands had gone still. For the first time all night, somewhere in the silence, every single person in that room understood that they had just heard something they had no right to hear, and would never forget, and that the name behind it, the name the old man had not yet said, was about to come, and that one man standing in the room already knew it. Room turned. Brant turned with it. And there stood a man none of the young ones recognized, but every one of them understood instantly, the way you understand a change in the weather before the first drop falls. Daniel Reyes, in a plain shirt and pressed slacks, with a bearing that no plain clothes on earth could disguise, his eyes fixed not on the chief, and not on the room, but on the old man, at the end of bar and brimming. "Say his name," Reyes said. His voice came out rough. The bar swung toward him in confusion. "Say his name," he said again, broke on him this time. This man who broke for nothing and no one, whose silences had ended careers. Earl studied him a long moment. Something moved in the old man's pale eyes, not recognition of the face. He had never seen this face before in his life, but recognition of the shape of the question. Of the impossible fact that someone in this bar, in this century, on this random Tuesday, already held the answer, and was asking only to hear it spoken aloud into the air. "Whose name, son?" Earl asked. His voice told everyone he already knew. "The man you carried," Reyes said. And he took one slow step forward across the scarred floor, 4th dive. The one you went back down, for after the safety boat had already given up and started pulling for shore. "My father was the 3rd man you brought up that night. You breathed for him on the rocks." Not a sound in the place. Mara stood frozen behind the taps, with a half-dried glass forgotten in her hand. Brant had gone the grey-white of old bone. "My father's name was Hector Reyes," the Master Chief said, and now the tears came down his face and he let them, made no move at all to stop them. This man of 29 years and a drawer full of ribbons. Petty officer, 19 years old, tangled on the anchor cable in 41-degree water on the 11th in 1970. And he told me every single year of my whole life, on this day, on the 11th, that he made it home to have me, only because one man flat refused to quit on him in the dark. He never knew your name. He went to his grave 19 years ago not knowing it. And I have looked for you, sir, in the face of every old man I have passed on every street for 19 years. He stopped a yard away. So tell me I have it wrong. Look me in the eye and tell me you're not him. And I'll buy your ginger ale and walk out that door and never trouble you again. Earl Driscoll set down his glass. For a long moment he did nothing at all but breathe. Then he reached into the right pocket of his old brown canvas jacket and took out a thing he carried always, a thing Mara had glimpsed 100 times across 2 years, and had assumed, without ever thinking about it, just an old man's pocket watch, a brass diver's depth gauge, heavy and dark with handling, its small round face crazed to a frost of fine cracks, its needle frozen hard at a single number where it had stopped one specific night and had never moved again in half a century. He set it on the bar beside his straight line of coins, and he set it down, gently, the precise way a man sets down something that is still alive. Then he pushed up the cuff of his left sleeve, slow, past the wrist, past the white scar that ran along the forearm. There on the inside of the arm, faded down to the dim blue-grey of old harbour water seen at evening, was a small tattoo, an anchor. Beneath the anchor, 2 letters and a single number, ES. 11. Reyes made a sound low in his chest. Earl looked down at the anchor on his own arm, as though it had been put there by, and belonged to, some other man entirely. Eddie Sullivan, he said quietly, and the name dropped into the dead-silent bar like a single stone into a still black pool, and the rings of it went out and out. Sully. He was my swim buddy. First man on the line that night. I was the second man. Knife in the left hand, like I told the chief here. That part was never a poem, son. That was just where I was standing in the dark. He turned the depth gauge a quarter turn on the bar, the same motion as the glass, the same motion as the watch case, the same motion as everything. A man who had spent 50 years turning small precise things to catch what little light there was. We were the Cold Water Annex, up the coast, one nobody can find on a map now. There were only ever 3 places on this whole earth where they taught that call and that answer the way you boys still say it, and ours was the only one of the 3 where it wasn't a drill we ran for a grade. He looked at Brant now. There was nothing cruel in it, nothing even close. The front half. Anybody who came through one of the 3 could give you the front half, but the back half. The count, the anchor, the carrying. We wrote the back half the morning after that night, 4 of us who could still hold a pencil. We wrote it down at a steel table, with our hands still shaking, and the salt still in our ears, because we had just learned the lesson the worst possible way a man can learn it. Sully went down on the first dive, and he did not surface, and I went back. I went back 4 times, and on the 4th I found him on the cable, and I could not get him loose and up to the air in time, no matter how I. The old man stopped. His jaw worked once. We made it a rule so that no man who ever came after us would have to learn it the way we did. You carry whoever doesn't surface. We carved it into ourselves with a pencil at a steel table so it would outlast us. I never knew they put it on a wall. He picked the gauge back up and closed his fist around it. They closed the annex in the spring of 71. Said, the cold water wasn't worth the cost of the men. Maybe they were right about that. Turned it over a few thousand nights, and I still couldn't tell you. His voice did not break, but it went somewhere very far off. somewhere 41 feet down and 51 years back. I have said that front half to exactly one living person between that night and tonight. Just now I said it twice, and I had every intention of going to my grave without ever saying the back half out loud to a soul again. Except this boy here looked at me and asked me how a man comes home. And I've spent 51 years answering that exact question every single day of my life, in the dark before I sleep. So I reckoned I owed him a true answer. He looked from Reyes to Brant and back. What none of them in that room yet realized was that the man who had owned this place an hour ago, the loud, cruel, grieving chief, about to do the single bravest thing anyone at Donahghue's would witness all night, and that he was going to do it on his knees. Brant was no longer on his stool. At some point in the last unbearable minute the chief had come down off it, not fallen but lowered, the way a controlled man lowers a heavy thing he can no longer hold. And now he was down on one knee, on the scarred and honest floor, with his forearm braced across the other knee, and his head dropped between his shoulders. And the broad back was moving, and the loud, cruel man, who had owned the whole room 20 minutes before, was simply and entirely a boy who had buried his best friend 11 days ago, and had been swinging at the entire world ever since, trying to make it confess that the death had meant something. And here it was. Here was the confession, 2 stools down, in the shape of a 78-year-old watch repairman, with a frozen brass gauge in his fist, and the confession was unbearable. And it was the only mercy on offer, both at the same time, the way the truest things always are. Daniel Reyes crossed the last of the floor, and he did not go to the old man first. Though every cell in his body was pulling him there, he went to the chief. He came down on one knee beside the younger man on the dirty floor, and he laid one broad flat hand on the back of Brant's neck, the exact way you steady a man at the rail of a boat that has begun to pitch under him. He bent his head close and said something low that only Brant would ever hear. And whatever the Master Chief said into the chief's ear, Brant nodded into his own hands and wept harder for it, and was not ashamed, and no one in that bar would ever once think to be ashamed for him. Then, and only then, did Command Master Chief Daniel Reyes rise back up to his full height, square his shoulders, turn to face the 78-year-old man at the end of the bar at Donahghue's, bring his right hand up, slow, and then snap it sharp and final to the corner of his brow, hold the salute there until the muscles of his arm began to tremble with it. On behalf of my father, he said, who could not be here tonight, and on behalf of his son, who is. Cole Whitman, the 19-year-old at the rail, was on his feet and saluting before he knew his legs had moved, getting the angle of it slightly wrong, and not caring even a little. Then the couple by the window stood, then a man at the dartboard who had served in another branch in another decade and never spoke of it, and Mara, who had never once in her life saluted another human being and didn't know how, set her rag down on the bar, came around the end of it, pressed her open hand flat against her own heart instead, and Earl Driscoll, who had built 50 quiet years on the solid bedrock of being nobody at all, sat very still under the strange, new and enormous weight of being seen, and let 2 tears track slowly down through the deep creases of his face, and did not lift a hand to wipe them, because both of his hands were busy holding a frozen depth gauge that still read the exact distance down to a place he had never, for one single night in 51 years, truly stopped going back to. For a long moment no one in the place moved or spoke. Then Earl did the thing he did on the 11th of every month. The thing Mara had watched a dozen times without ever once understanding, that she understood now all at once and completely, with a small sharp catch in her own throat. He reached over to the full and untouched ginger ale, standing sweating on the bar in front of the empty stool to his left, and he lifted it an inch off the wood, and he said, so softly that only the 2 or 3 nearest him caught the words at all, "Slack tide, Sully. I'm still on the wire." He set the full glass carefully back down where it had been, and he turned his attention to his line of coins, slid them one by one off the edge of the bar into his palm. He had never finished his own drink. It no longer seemed to matter in the slightest. Brant got himself up off the floor. He came the 2 stools down, unsteady, scrubbing the heel of his hand hard across his face, and he stopped in front of the old man and stood there. And he did not say that he was sorry, because sorry was a coin too small for what he owed, and he was sober enough now, suddenly and completely sober, to know it. Instead he came to attention, wobbling, red-eyed, 11 days hollow, but rigid from his heels to the crown of his head. "Chief," he said, and his voice came apart and he let it. "I had a man go in the water 11 days ago, Petty Officer Danny Marsh. I had a clear shot at him, and I could not get to him in time. His jaw fought him for the next part, and lost. And I've spent every hour since standing in front of anybody who'd hold still, telling them all the things we know that they don't. Because the second I stop talking, I have to feel it." He swallowed hard. "You didn't say one word to anybody for 51 years. You just carried him, every day, and I don't know how a man does that. I came in here tonight to make the world prove it meant something. I think I can't do this." And Earl Driscoll reached up with both of his scarred and steady and impossibly gentle hands, the hands that could hear a mainspring breathe, took the young chief's shaking hand into them, and held it, and he said, "You don't carry a man by talking about him, son. You carry him by getting up tomorrow and living a life that's worth the one he handed back to you. That's the whole secret. It's all 51 years of it." He held the boy's eye. "Go open the coffee roaster." Brant's whole face came apart at that, because he had never told the old man about Ohio. He had never said the words coffee roaster out loud to one living person, not to his own mother, not to Steph, not to the chaplain. But grief knows grief across any distance and any number of years, and Earl Driscoll had simply known it, the way he knew the broken inside of a watch by feel through a steel pin in the dark. And what neither of them could yet imagine was that by the grey light of the very next morning, a stranger 90 miles away would press his thumb to a glowing screen, hit play on 31 shaking seconds of phone video, and set in motion the thing that would mean the last stool at Donahghue's never sat empty on the 11th again. In the weeks that followed, the story moved the way that stories move now. One of the 3 phone videos, the one shot from the booth where you could hear the old man say, "You carry whoever doesn't surface. You do not ever leave a man in the dark," found its way onto the small glowing screens of 200,000 strangers. And then 2 million, then a number nobody bothered to keep track of anymore. The comments filled and overflowed with a single word, typed, over and over, by people who had never served a day, and by people who had served and bled and buried friends of their own, all of them reaching for the same small, wholly inadequate way to say the same thing. "I see him now. I'm sorry it took me so long. I see him. Part of it that actually mattered did not happen on any screen at all. It happened on the 11th of the very next month, when Earl Driscoll walked into Donahghue's at 7 o'clock, as he had 1,000 times before, and found the last stool at the curve of the bar already, taken, by Daniel Reyes in civilian clothes, with 2 ginger ales already poured and standing ready, and a fresh slice of lime balanced on the rim of each one. And it happened again the month after that, when there were 4 men waiting at the bar instead of 1. And again the month after that, when there were 9. Young operators and grey-haired ones, some who had driven through the night, Some who had flown in on their own dime, every last one of them there for the same plain reason. To sit a while on the 11th with the man who had written the shaking pencil at a steel table, the promise they had each recited by heart in the cold and the dark, and to make certain their own eyes and their own untouched glasses that the second ginger ale was never again the only one on that bar lifted an inch in honour of a name. They learned Eddie Sullivan's name. They learned all 4 of the names from that night, which Reyes had quietly tracked down through records nobody was supposed to still have. He had the 4 names cut into a small plain brass plate, with Mara's blessing. Mara, who cried when he asked her, and pretended she hadn't. The plate was screwed to the wall above the last stool, just below the curling yellowed Polaroids of all the other dead and beloved regulars, and it is bolted there to this day. Tyler Brant did not re-up when his contract ran out that fall. He went home to Ohio. He found a second-hand drum roaster off a county road outside Danny Marsh's hometown, the way Danny always said he would, and he opened the doors. Over the counter, he hung one photograph of a grinning kid in a grey t-shirt, and beneath the photograph, in a hand he had practiced at a kitchen table night after night, until the letters came out, as even and steady as a thing set in type. He painted 4 words. He named the dark roast after every man in the platoon, one by one, just like the plan, and he telephones Earl Driscoll every Sunday now, at 4:30, right after the old man hangs up with his sister in Bakersfield. Earl Driscoll still fixes watches in the narrow room over the laundromat that never did reopen, and he still sets out 2 cups on the counter every single morning. And he still fills the one and washes only the one at night. Most days the whole wide world still slides right on past his tidy, harmless, unremarkable face on the street, without so much as a flicker. And that, more than anything, is exactly how he has always wanted it. He never asked to be seen. He spent the better part of a lifetime perfecting the difficult art of not being seen, and he is not about to give it up now over one loud night in a bar. The brass depth gauge sits on his workbench these days, beside the green-shaded lamp and the apothecary cabinet with its 48 steady lettered drawers, its needle still frozen hard at 41 feet, where it stopped a half-century ago and where it will stay. And sometimes late, when the last watch is back together and ticking soft in its felt tray, and his own scarred hands have finally gone still for the night, the old man picks the gauge up off the bench and turns it a slow quarter turn to catch the lamplight. The way he turns everything, he counts 1, 2, 3, 4. To the anchor, up slow and breathes slower, and then he sets it down and switches off the green lamp, goes to the kitchen to wash the single cup, and to leave the other one clean and dry and waiting on the counter for a morning that he knows will not come, and that he sets the table for anyway, because that is what it means to carry a man all the way up and never leave him in the dark. If this story got hold of something in you tonight, if you believe the quiet ones who carry the heaviest things and never mention the weight deserve to be truly seen at least once before the end, then do one small thing for Earl, for Sully, for every name cut into a wall no one stops to photograph. Subscribe so the next story like this one finds you. Type the 4 words they wrote with shaking hands the morning after the cold took 4 good men. We carry them home.